So we're on the southern coast of Ghana in West Africa, about 100 miles west of the capital city of Accra. And we're looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. And behind me, actually, we're standing on the location of the Cape Coast Castle. In the 16th century, this was the largest English base of the African slave trade. Between the 15th and 19th century, up to 10 to 12 million Africans were taken from Africa and sent to the Americas, and a large percentage of those came from West Africa, from places like this. Slaves that were captured and sold up country in open air markets were brought to this place. They were kept in dungeons. They were held there until they were sent out of what's called the door of no return, never to see their homeland again. And while the stories of slavery are familiar, I want to highlight especially a few religious dimensions. We'll mention briefly just 3 religious traditions and how they relate to this place. First is the religion of Islam. Many people in the Americas believe or assume that Islam is a new phenomenon in the Americas, that Muslims came to the United States and to North America especially through immigration from the Middle East and elsewhere in the 20th century. But actually, the story of Islam goes back much, much earlier. In fact, long before the United States was even a nation, Islam first came to North and South America in large numbers on slave ships. Because Islam, from the 9th century, Islam was especially prominent in West Africa. And we now know that up to 20 to 25% of the slaves that left places like the Cape Coast Castle were Muslim. And so that means that millions of Muslims reached American shores. The Christian veneer of American slavery squashed a lot of the Muslim practices and beliefs, but they didn't completely disappear. And some of that sense of Islamic identity actually resurfaced in the early 20th century in the African American community. And today, a large percentage of American Muslims are African American. The second religious tradition that I'll highlight is African traditional religions or African traditions. And obviously, before the Portuguese and the British and the others came here, African communities had their traditional beliefs and practices, and those still are very prominent here. In fact, inside this castle right now is a shrine to a local god named Nana Tabir. And it's a local god associated with the rocks along the coast, associated with the sea, associated with the very rocks on which this castle was built. And inside this castle now there's a shrine. It has some candles and some flowers. There's a priest that sits there, and you can make a small donation. Some people are disturbed by that, thinking it's commercializing African traditions. Other people find it a meaningful way to remember and connect to the people who lost their lives here, connect to African identity and African agency. But whatever your response to it, it at least reflects the fact that African traditions and African traditional religions are still important and still present here. But also, just like Islam, those African traditions were also put on slave ships, and they were taken to the Americas, and they mixed with local traditions there. And so it was African traditions and African traditional religions that took on new forms in the Americas. Forms like Candomblé or Santeria or Haitian voodoo and other forms of indigenous practices that are actually today in the 21st century are achieving a kind of revival. But the third and last religious tradition I want to mention is that of Christianity. And as a Christian myself, this is the tradition that I find most disturbing in connection with this place. Because the European countries and the European leaders that were a part of establishing this castle and establishing the African slave trade were Christian. And in fact, while I talked about the dungeons underneath where the slaves were held in some very desperate circumstances, right on top of those dungeons, just a few meters above them, were the living quarters of British, spacious rooms and offices, parquet floors and balconies overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. But also, right above some of the dungeons was a Christian chapel where many of the British and some of their African converts would meet and worship. They would worship God and they would claim Jesus as their Lord. The same Jesus who himself called people to radical love and called for the release of all captives. And so part of what I have to do as a Christian as I'm in a place like this is to ask, how did Jesus followers justify this kind of activity? How were they so blind to what was going on as they worshiped God above while they were the perpetrators of so much human suffering just below their feet? But I also have to ask, how am I guilty of similar justifications? How am I blind to injustices? Some of those are the questions that I ask and the reflections I have as I tour this place.